name is Catherine. I'm an OpenSciEd teacher, facilitator, and writer. And in this video, we're going to explore Lesson 8 of the P.1 electricity unit. Lesson 8 is the last lesson of the first lesson set and is where we actually get an answer on what happened in Texas. So let's take a look at how we get here. If you recall last lesson, we figured out that power companies had to make a decision on where they're going to send their power and who was not going to get power, and that there wasn't any factor in the data at the county level that we analyzed that could explain how this choice was made. So at the end of lesson 7, we were wondering if looking at the same data at a smaller grain size by zooming in on any particular county, if this could give us insight on how power companies might have made choices on who lost power and who did not. So let's look at lesson 8 at a glance. This is a 2-day putting the pieces together routine lesson, and putting the pieces together is exactly like it sounds. It's where we take our learning over the last couple of lessons and we put what we figured out together into one coherent model or explanation of the thing that we've been investigating. Students will need electronic devices both days of this lesson. And let's take a look at what they do with them here in each day in these 2 key sense-making loops. So in day 1, students use devices to listen to an interview podcast with an energy expert and to get some insight on what their team discovered happened in Texas as a result of the choices made by power companies and how those power companies made those choices. And through this podcast, we realized that people, if they lived in a high minority neighborhood, they were more likely to lose power in Texas. And we realized that that doesn't kind of sit well with us. So in day 2, we try to gather some more information about how these disparities existed and impacted people. And while people lost power from all income levels, or people lost power for a variety of reasons based upon where they lived, that those existing disparities that might exist because I live in a high minority neighborhood or a non-high minority neighborhood, those existing disparities were exacerbated by these power outages. And so what we figure out here is that it really was just an imbalance of energy supply and demand all along, as we've been speculating, but that there were some design solutions that were made in deciding who had power and who didn't. And there are some design solutions that could have avoided this altogether, but that all design solutions come with trade-offs. And again, across Texas, what neighborhood people lived in was the highest factor in whether or not they had power. And those power outages had, again, an inequitable impact on communities that already had an existing disparity. And throughout Texas, it seemed most commonly power companies made decisions to keep power on in neighborhoods that they deemed had essential buildings, as they wanted to keep things operable that were essential to the community. But when they turned the power off in an area that they deemed non-essential, they didn't necessarily think about who they were turning the power off on. So let's explore these 2 key moments a little bit further with our podcast and our following discussions. Parts 2 and 3, again, this occurs in day 1. This is the podcast and the small and whole group discussion we have about it. And some key ideas from the podcast that we want to highlight with students through discussion is that extreme weather events are becoming more common. So we really need to think about how we can protect our grid and make it more reliable in these unpredicted times. Again, people in high minority neighborhoods that had non-essential buildings, those were the people who lost power. And that if energy is going in the grid system, if it's spread too thin, then there would not have been enough energy in those electrons in those wires, and that this could have caused the whole grid to shut down for weeks at a time. And this is why the power company had to act and to turn power off rather than just kind of letting a low amount exist throughout the system. And you could, in this discussion, refer back to the previous lesson where we tested this idea in the electric city, where we didn't crank the generator hard enough and we kind of had some like dimming, hard to see lights on, that in reality, that would not work. And could cause those electrons to lose so much energy that the whole grid shut down until we could get the right amount of energy back in the system. So in day 2, we explore the idea of these disparities because it didn't, again, sit well with us that while the power companies did not really think about people, they thought about buildings. Their choices to send power certain places and not send power other places resulted in that disparity of the neighborhood being my number one factor in deciding if I lost power or not. So in day 2, we read about some of these people who were impacted. And we read some case studies that have stories of 2 different families that are fictional in nature in this article, but are based off of actual experiences collected from this crisis that happened in Texas. And as we read, we think about the trade-offs associated with this imbalance of supply and demand and how it affected people differently. And whether or not it was okay for the power company to only think about buildings that they deemed essential and non-essential rather than thinking about the humans that were impacted. And that these readings, just for your knowledge, they have an introduction that reviews those key ideas from the podcast in case a student was absent or students were struggling with identifying some of those key ideas by listening to that podcast the day before. So where we go from here at the end of lesson 8, we thought about this idea of trade-off and the trade-offs of the decision that had to be made when supply was low. So this makes us wonder, are there other design choices that could have been made to have prevented all of this? And what could we do knowing that these extreme weather events are becoming more common? What could we do to prepare? And this type of thinking will move us forward into lesson 9 in the second lesson set of this unit. So let's take a look at some material management tips and tricks to get you prepared here to implement lesson 8. The biggest thing to be aware of is the podcast, as many of our students might not be used to listening to a podcast or listening to something that is 15 minutes in length all at one time. So to help aid with this, there is a transcript of that podcast that students can listen and read and follow along, as well as use for the discussion that follows. And when you prepare your students to listen to the podcast, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You could have them gather around computers in separate areas and listen to it in small groups. Perhaps they're wearing headphones when they do that. Or maybe you can let students listen on their own with headphones and maybe walk around your campus if it's a nice day before coming back together. There is a listening group roles reference sheet in the folder that could help you assign group roles to students if you want them to listen to the podcast on their own or in a small group and discuss in a small group. And then alternatively, you could play this podcast for the whole class and periodically pause the podcast and discuss at appropriate times. So it's kind of up to you to decide what works best for you and your students. Lastly here, don't forget about the electronic exit ticket at the end of lesson 8 here. It'll give you some data on how our students putting the pieces together around this idea of choices being made when we had low supply but high demand on where to send that energy and where not to. No new words that we co-construct with students in this lesson, but we do introduce the idea of trade-off. We're not yet going to add that to our glossary because we'll continue to build understanding around this concept in the lessons that follow at the beginning of the next lesson set. And then as terms of like posters and things that you want around in your room, there are no new ones that we create in this lesson. There are no specific ones that we refer to from previous lessons. But we do have that engineering design tracker that we've been hanging on to since lesson 3. Students will add to it in this lesson and will need it for subsequent lessons that follow. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you are as excited as I am and my students when we finally get an answer to what happened in Texas, and give us the opportunity to begin exploring the idea of ethics and how we choose to make decisions in science and engineering. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope to see you again in a future video.